The Ordinance Committee will have a meeting on a petition actually filed by me as on Article 5.0 as it relates to rainwater in flat roofs. There is a quorum here. I'm joined by Jeff Roberts from CDD, Vice Mayor Devereaux, Councillor Siddiqui, Councillor Mallon, and Councillor Carlone, along with the City Clerk, Donna Lopez. The meeting is being audio and video recorded. There are attendee and speaker sign-up sheets. If a member of the public does not wish to speak, please indicate no on the speaker sign-up sheet. If members of the public have written comments, please ask them to leave them with the city clerk or to email them to the city clerk at dlopez@cambridgema.gov. The petitioners will be heard first, that's me, followed by city staff, which I assume is Jeff. And then we can talk amongst ourselves. And after I give my presentation, if people have specific questions about the presentation, I can answer them then, or when we get back to the rest of us talking, that would be a perfectly fine place too. Because I'm the petitioner, the clerk and I have decided that it would be more appropriate for Dennis to chair during the presentation, and then when that part's done, I'll come back up here and sit. So Dennis, if you would take over, please. Okay, the world looks different from down here.
Do I look taller?
You look magnificently spectacular. So we've been through this once before. I suspect we'll be through something like it again, although not necessarily on flat roofs. But this is an amendment to, or proposed amendment to our zoning code that would allow people to do certain things to certain flat roofs. And I'm going to walk people through it. If you want to flag me down and ask a question, please feel free. All right, well, we've reached our first challenge here. Alex! I forget who it was that said no plan survives contact with reality, but so why worry about flat roofs now? And we worry about it primarily because of climate change. Climate change it's here, it's real, it's pretty much every day. The news is worse than we'd expected it was going to be, and there's no reason to think the trend won't continue. So who else is worried about climate change and its impact on the built environment? Well, the city's Climate Protection Action Committee has some thoughts on this, and they are eager to minimize greenhouse gases from emissions from all measurable sources, which our greenhouse gases come in large part, but certainly not the majority, from our residential buildings. The Urban Land Institute, which is an environmental group, and I bolded this on my own, says that new strategies for building envelopes and flood-proofing will need to become commonplace when they're talking about the urban experience in the future. The reason why we're concerned about roof drains is that central drains on a flat roof, they clog or they can clog. There are a little bit of different thoughts on this, but in some cases they will clog when the roof is insulated because the heat from inside the house doesn't melt the snow, so if the ice forms, it just doesn't unform. And since the water flows to the center drain, if the water flows there and then freezes and doesn't unfreeze, you've got a center drain that just never undrains, and you can get something like a swimming pool effect. So you can see on the top, that's a well-insulated flat roof. The snow's not melting, neither is the ice that apparently blocked that drain. And that's Nico Kuchai's house I believe. And the one that's next to him is one below, and that's an uninsulated or poorly insulated flat roof where the roof just doesn't have enough insulation to keep the snow and the ice on it, which of course means that people heating the house are sending a lot of heat outside the house. So there's an incentive not to insulate a flat roof. And as you can see in this picture, the flat roof combines, and not all flat roofs do this, by the way. It's got to have a central drain. Not all flat roofs automatically have a central drain, but it's pretty common. The drain is in the middle of the roof. The roof slopes down towards the drain, and then the drain goes down through the house and connects to the MWRA sewage system. On the way, it picks up the water from toilets, showers, sinks, whatever else is in the house that would otherwise be going to the MWRA. And this is our rough, thank you, Councillor Zondervan's just arrived. This is a rough estimate of how much rain a single triple decker gets. It's not inconsequential, obviously, given the overall surface area of Cambridge. It's not massive, but this isn't a small amount. So who else is worried about stormwater and its impact on the built environment? So the University of Illinois says a bunch of things, but one of the things is that one basic starting point for such a plan, and that's my emphasis as well, is for homeowners to reduce runoff from their individual lots. Many simple yet effective methods can be used to help reduce individual runoff. So the impact of building on climate, the need to think about runoff, stormwater, and things like that, you could spend an awful lot of time on the internet finding an awful lot of people that say that we need to start thinking about this in new and more effective ways. Those are just a couple of examples that we pulled up. So right now, the insulated flat roofs are likely to result in, and again, some people think differently. This is certainly Nikolai's experience, and it makes a lot of sense to me, but it could be very roof dependent. So insulated flat roofs are likely to result in snow and ice buildup, damaging flooding when the water can't go down that drain, and then if you get a buildup of ice and snow, you can get structural challenges as well. I don't know that there's a history in Cambridge of structural challenges, but certainly one has seen flat roof challenges elsewhere, and that could happen here. So the flat roof amendment is basically allowing FAR and or height relief for residential property owners to replace them with something that's pitched and insulated. It would cut down on greenhouse emissions, and it would also cut down on the water getting sent into the MWRA. The incentive is the extra FAR and the ability to add height to your building. Generally, these challenges aren't so horrible that homeowners or property owners are willing to do this without some sort of incentive, and FAR is a good way to give that kind of incentive. So it provides that incentive. They pitch the flat roof. The MWRA no longer gets the rainwater because that's going off to the site. The stormwater gets managed on-site or off by the special permit process. It separates the household sewage and stormwater, and to some extent it could modestly recharge the groundwater. None of this is sort of heroic in terms of changing the status quo, but all of it counts for something. So flat roof amendments do provide some protection for neighbors, so you need a special permit, which is not a huge barrier, but nonetheless it is a barrier and something that almost always results in a better project when you go through the special permit process. And there's specific language there that says that retaining stormwater is important, basically without direct encumbrance onto abutting properties. The idea is we don't want someone taking a flat roof, pitching it, and taking all the water that would have gone to the MWRA and put it in their neighbor's basement or the neighbor's flower garden or whatever instead. So that would be covered under the special permit process. We're narrowly defining this issue. It's a flat roof amendment. There are lots of other challenges in the world, and there are lots of more important challenges in the world. This is a small one, but there was an attempt to address a bigger one. It was a Brown petition, and that didn't go very far. So we've sort of got two spectrums here. One is the tiny flat roof amendment. One is the Brown amendment. The Brown amendment didn't move forward. Last time up, the flat roof amendment didn't move forward. You'll hear from Mr. Roberts that the planning board was intrigued but not supportive of this petition, if I can summarize them in just a couple of words. But it was narrowly defined intentionally. We're trying to find something small that we can agree on. The purpose is to incentivize greenhouse gas by reducing reducing installation of flat roofs. And these are residential flat roofs. We're not talking about Fresh Pond Mall or something like that. And that would reduce the concerns about clogged drains, and then would also create the FAR height options to compensate for construction costs, cut down on the sewerage, and maximize its return to local ecosystems. There is some thought that the more water you put back into the ground, the better your carbon sequestration is as well, although I couldn't find specific data on that. This is what it could look like, not what it would look like. You can see that there's some sort of cistern functions, little barrels off to the side of the building to capture the rainwater. The idea is that you would capture a certain amount of rainwater, so a huge storm might overwhelm the capture points, but multiple smaller storms would most likely not. So there are concerns about this. Cambridge has got iconic triple deckers, and they're often very close to each other. And one fear is that by changing that with increased size and height, you're going to make an area less attractive and negatively impact people who have become used to and like that triple decker feeling. I think these are some representations of what the view might look like. Arguably, it's going to be minimal. It's not going to be non-existent, but it's going to be minimal. Depending on where you are, it could be more if you're on the third floor of an adjacent house. Obviously, the extension of a roof upward would have a bigger impact than if you're on the first floor of that same house. It would have minimal impact on the neighbor's natural light or view. There is a proposal for setbacks here so that the wall of the building wouldn't just go straight up for another floor. And we do have some examples of what places look like with these modified triple deckers or properties that might have been built in this form to begin with and weren't modified. I'll get to them later. So by addressing these concerns through limiting the FAR increase, we're suggesting a limit of just 20% over the existing FAR, which is far less than a complete floor. We are having a suggestion of 3 feet setbacks for the sides and the rear and 6 feet for the front, and maximum roof height gain of 10 feet. And Mr. Roberts may get into some of the challenges that the planning board had with the specificity of this language, but the idea is not to add a whole nother floor and not to add a whole lot of height, but to give the property owner the incentive to actually do the work and to move the water onto the property and put in the insulation. These are some examples of what a fourth floor of some sort added to a triple decker might look like. They're not great examples necessarily. Not all of those were triple deckers when they started out, but you can see that it is not necessarily overly, at least I don't think it's not necessarily overly imposing or changing of a neighborhood to have structures like this getting modified. There's also the concern about relaxing the zoning limits and creating value for certain people through the special permit process. You know, we've done that before. We're going to talk about it again later in a different committee meeting. But when we do almost any sort of zoning, we create value for some people. In fact, we talked about that last night when we talked about trying to capture the value of an upzoning. So we do this a lot through specific zoning relief. This is the accessory dwelling unit discussion that we're going to have shortly, but it's one example of how the BZA, through a special permit, can allow certain things to do. And this is, again, back to the special permit. You say this is what we can and have done through our zoning is giving permitting power to a board to approve specific things under specific conditions. So it's good for the environment. It's an interesting new idea, and it is something that the city doesn't have to fund because it would fund itself through the incentives on the FAR. We have a little bit of the background. I'm going to skip all this because we've seen it before. We do have some considerations about how this might move forward in terms of providing for solar panels, roof gardens, things like that. Those are things that could be taken into consideration. And that is the end. And honestly, I don't think it's going anywhere, which is okay. But I think that, and I'm glad I did this, and the planning board is a really interesting experience. I'm viewing this now as a thought experiment to try and figure out what is the best way to do things like this in the future, because we've got a rapidly changing world, a rapidly changing ecology, a rapidly changing technological set of things, rapidly changing demographics. And I think it was Hugh Russell and the planning board said, maybe we need some Department of Small Changes plan. Because we can't, I don't think, go through this every time someone comes up with a specific challenge and a specific need. So with that being said, I appreciate everyone's attention to this, and I will turn it over to Mr. Roberts.
Before you do that,
sorry.
Are there any clarification questions that the council might have of the petition? Or we can wait for the full discussion? Looks like we're going to wait for the full discussion. Thank you, Craig. Thank you. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To whichever chair I'm addressing. Jeff Roberts, Director of Zoning and Development. I'll try to be fairly brief. This is a proposal that the Planning Board has and the Council has reviewed on a few different occasions over the years. There have been some modifications to the most recent version. The Planning Board held a hearing on this on January 22nd of this year. As in the past, the Planning Board concluded with a vote to not recommend adoption of the petition. While the board expressed a great deal of sympathy with the goals that are expressed by the petition of trying to enable the separation of stormwater from central storm drains, and was also supportive of the general notion that that zoning incentives may be appropriate to achieve public policy goals related to sustainability. The board was concerned about singling out this very specific type of improvement and providing a significant incentive or increase in development capacity for this one type of project for one very specific type of building, when there may be other incentives or other priorities that need to be weighed along with it, because of the nature of how zoning incentives work. Where it has to, in order to be meaningful, there has to be a balance between the restrictions and the allowances, and there have a lot of different priorities need to be weighed at the same time. There were some specific issues that were raised as well. I think there was some concern about the actual impact of having these additional kind of structures built on buildings, both in terms of the prevailing character of neighborhoods that had predominantly three-story flat roof buildings, as well as some technical issues that were raised at one point about whether a feasible project could be enabled under the zoning as it's proposed, or if there would be other sort of physical technical constraints in construction that would need to be dealt with. There were some thoughts about whether this particular approach of building an additional kind of partial structure was really the best way to deal with the issue of central storm drains. There were suggestions that there could be other measures that are more limited in scale, such as adding a slight pitch to the roof and making some plumbing modifications that would have the same overall effect of diverting water from the storm drains. And there were questions about whether for these kinds of changes, whether there should be input from the historical commission, what the impacts would be on historic resources. There was also some comment about just the feasibility for properties that have multiple owners that are, and as many buildings like this are, in a condominium ownership structure, whether this kind of an approach would be effective, given that it would be more difficult for multiple condo owners to kind of share in the benefit of the additional value from a zoning change like this. So those were some of the issues that were raised in the planning board's hearing. The council should be receiving that report in the future. That hasn't been submitted yet, but that summarizes the board's comments.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. Does any counselor have a comment or question for Jeff? Please, Councilor Zondervan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Mr. Roberts, do we know how many triple deckers would actually be eligible for this type of zoning?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it was the subject of some discussion in the past review, and I don't believe there is a specific answer to the question. I know that there was one area of the city in particular that was being looked at as part of the sewer stormwater separation project by the Department of Public Works, and within that particular area, they had a rough idea of how many buildings fit that characteristic, and if one were to generalize that across the entire city, it might be around 1,000. We said that's a very rough figure. Could be hundreds less or hundreds more than that, but it's a fraction of the residential buildings. So there's about 11,000 residential buildings across the city. So this might be just somewhere under 10% of those 11,000 buildings. The majority are the kind of wood frame homes, 2-3 family type homes. So it would be a fairly small percentage of the total residential housing units or housing structures.
Thank you. And is there any thoughts to maybe incorporating some of the issues raised in this in a broader rezoning around energy efficiency, stormwater capture, renewable energy, particularly aimed at these residential structures? Because obviously, I'm aware that there's efforts for larger buildings, but in terms of existing residential buildings, it might make sense to look at the overall question of how do we make those buildings more sustainable going forward.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm maybe not as much of an expert on this subject as Councilor Zondervan, but we've been working through the Net Zero Action Plan as well as the ongoing climate change preparedness and resilience planning of the city. Those two planning processes have generated a number of different zoning initiatives, including initiatives to revise our standards for sustainable building design for new, larger development, changes to facilitate improved insulation for insulation upgrades for existing buildings. There's discussion more recently of incentives for better energy performance, heading towards net zero development. There's the climate resilient zoning task force process, which is underway to discuss resilience initiatives that can be and standards that could be incorporated into zoning, which could range from large development to smaller buildings. So there are a number of initiatives underway. I know that that those initiatives don't cover the full gamut of the issues that are identified in those planning efforts, but they're being addressed kind of in the priority order that was indicated in those planning efforts. So this is certainly something that could be part of an effort that comes along down the road.
Councilor Sondervan, from a construction point of view and an architectural point of view, the obvious easy thing to do is to add insulation that casts the water toward gutters into dry wells. And that's what you do on a commercial building when you redo the roof. And I'm sure there's some complexity here, but that is by far the easiest, most direct way from energy and water conservation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that there are a lot of questions around how we deal with our existing building stock. Again, particularly these smaller residential buildings. It might make sense to think about a zoning effort that really takes a broader look at just that particular building stock. I recently visited with a resident, well, a potential resident who bought property in Cambridge and is trying to rebuild it and is running into zoning issues, but wants to build a passive house. And so, again, it seems like there's opportunities to streamline our zoning so that if somebody is trying to modify or rebuild some of these smaller structures, that we provide some incentives and accommodation for changes that they're making to make the building more sustainable. I think this is very narrow, and it may just be too narrow for us to move it forward. But a more comprehensive look might be warranted here.
Thank you. I believe the Vice Mayor wanted to say something. No? Yes, and then Councilor Siddiqui, and then Councilor Kelly.
Okay.
Please.
Thank you. A couple thoughts. One of the images showed essentially rain barrels or something to catch the water. Maybe this is more for Councilor Kelly. And that seems like a pretty low budget, low tech solution. I would be concerned unless there was something like what you were describing, Councilor Carlone, where you actually require a connection into a dry well, that residents would do things which I've seen in my neighborhood, which is to construct sort of Rube Goldberg, very elaborate connections of downspouts from gutters that end up pouring out onto the sidewalk. That's the easy way to to do that, and then it creates ice on the sidewalk, and it's a huge mess, and that's not what we want. So I think you'd have to be really specific about where this water goes if it's not going into the MWRA thing.
Actually, what you're describing is against city code.
Well, I can think of
It happens.
3 houses in the direct vicinity of the house that the original petitioner owns that do this. Secondly, I noticed in one of the images and on the original petitioner's own roof that there is now sort of a railing, a sort of just, in this case, it's a plywood railing. If you had a structure on the roof, would you then be required to have a railing that extended up above for some code reason because someone might be on the roof and might fall off? Because that also is aesthetically not terribly attractive. So even if you set back this new structure, you might end up with essentially a fence around the top of the roof, and that could also be done in a way that isn't particularly in keeping with the rest of things. If you were to put solar panels on a flat roof, they would have to be pitched and angled. Would that help to either melt the snow or keep it from piling up because it's going to fall on the panel, and then the panel...
They could be just flat.
They could be flat, but if they were pitched, would that provide pitch to let both rain and snow?
No, you still have to pitch the roof.
Okay, we can't
I don't
hear
know.
the whole conversation, so
Councilor Zondervan is saying you'd still have to pitch the roof itself to get it to flow off. I see what you're saying. You could, yeah. So I don't know. I kind of agree with the direction that the planning board indicated. I suppose this could be among the things that the Climate Resiliency Task Force includes in terms of looking at ways to help homeowners make their houses more resilient, but that may not be within their immediate scope. I know they have bigger fish to fry. Thank you.
thank you. So we're asking Mr. Roberts questions. Is your comment a question? Great. Councilor Siddiqui, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I believe it is. I think I mentioned this last time too. We keep talking about significant value for one group, and I can imagine what it is, but I am curious just how we're talking about upzoning. How are we defining that? It's still pretty vague to me. Is it another $100,000 worth or 200? That I'm clear. I'm unclear on that. And then secondly, I mostly concur with my colleagues on this. I think I can imagine, and you mentioned this at the end, Jeff, the difficulties with condo associations and getting permission to do that. So how many, this is just to go back to Councilor Zondervan's point of, if there's 1,000 triple deckers, how many are already, most of them are probably converted to condos, and then we're going to run up against, I think about how people may want to implement this, and you're still going to have to get permission from the condo association, and the condo rules are pretty strict. So I'm just playing this out of how many people would actually go about using this. Is it 2? Is it 3? Yes. So it's more of a. So I guess the initial question is: has the planning board defined the value? Has the CDD thought about that more clearly?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think the question of increasing value isn't it's not necessarily from the perspective of just to answer the question simply. There hasn't been, and I don't necessarily know how one would go about studying this particular proposal in terms of how much value would be generated. It could vary significantly depending on the circumstances of the particular case. If somebody, someone who is looking to, purchase a building of this type and is going to totally gut renovate it and fix it up and make a whole lot of improvements, could see significantly increased value by being able to increase the total square footage by 20%. If you're looking at it purely from a per square foot standpoint, an increase of 20% in floor area can be an increase in 20% of around 20% in value. But of course, it depends on other factors as well. If in terms of the number of units that could be built on the site under zone, which is still a limitation in zoning, if the project were, if it were an existing building where the homeowner just wanted to add some more space for living area, that could increase the value of that unit, but have different impacts on the value of the property as a whole. As for the question, getting then to the question about how many of these buildings are under condominium, that's something that I don't have an answer to now. We might be able to get that information based on assessing records, or we might be able to make an estimate of how many buildings of this type are under a condo regime versus a single owner that wouldn't have to go through a condo association to make those improvements. But again, going back to the value portion, I think the issue that the board has been looking at isn't necessarily to quantify the value of the particular improvement, but to consider, is the public purpose or the public outcome of this superior to, say, if it were additional FAR or additional density that were allowed for achieving some other purpose. So it's really a matter of evaluating the outcomes for their public benefit, rather than necessarily looking at specifically at what the value would be created for the property owner.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilor Kelly?
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Roberts. I think that was a very accurate description of the planning board's comments and concerns. You may not have this off the top of your head, but we've drifted into this territory. How many people have used our insulation rezoning off the top of your head? Do you have a clue?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't. I know that it has not been very many. I know that what we've been working on more recently is looking at additional modifications to that zoning that could be made to enable more properties to be able to use it. There are a lot of nonconformities out there, and the current zoning doesn't really address all of them. So there are a lot of buildings that, just by their existing conditions, wouldn't be able to utilize that provision. The other issue is it's a provision in the dimension that modifies the dimensional standards of the zoning. It doesn't require a special permit or anything. So it's more difficult to give kind of a count of for projects that require a special permit. You can just sort of count the number of special permits. For this, for just applying a particular zoning provision, we would have to do some more in-depth analysis and might just have to estimate what properties are using that provision. But we can try to get that information, and we will again be discussing that particular zoning, we hope, in the near future.
Thank you.
Councilor Mallon, do you have any questions? Thank you. So, yes, Vice Mayor.
Thank you. Just one follow-up question. If we were to ordain this, would it still require a special permit? So,
No.
yeah. Okay.
As I understand it, that's correct, right, Councilor Kelly? It's special permit,
From
yes.
the BZA or the planning board?
Planning board is the response.
Mr. Chair, I think in the petition it says. Actually, I lost it, so I don't know what it says. I actually thought it was the BZA.
So did I.
As the petition was written. Yeah.
The petitioner says you're right. Any other questions before we open it up to the vast audience and public comment? Does anyone wish to give us public comment? So I am now officially closing public comment and opening up the council discussion period on the merits of the petition, during which we can still ask questions about the petitioner and the city if any come up. So Councilor Kelly, please.
Thank you. And I admit that, as I said before, I've sort of kissed this one goodbye as a specific, but I think we need to think of it, and I think we can go back to the insulation zoning as an example. We specifically rezoned to allow for this sort of super insulated type house, and it turns out that it's really not being used by a lot of people, and it's not doing exactly what we wanted it to do. We rezoned for accessory dwelling units, and we'll talk about that later, but similarly, that turned out not to have been a perfect petition, so we're coming back. And that itself was an amendment to an existing accessory dwelling unit provision in the code. So we have a history of zoning for things, and they're not huge things that will impact a whole lot of people, even if they're overlay districts for the whole city. They're not necessarily things we get perfect or even close to perfect the first time, so they might see less use than we had anticipated, and yet we still do it. We still do it, and we say, well, you know what, we can come back and visit this if it turns out that we didn't do the right thing. So I hope that I would hope that we were to do that with this. I don't think that's going to happen, but I think what we do need to do is try and figure out a new way of thinking about this, because if it's not roofs, it's going to be where people put their batteries or where they put their geotechno wells to pull up groundwater, or all these other things that arguably aren't in our zoning code. Someone's going to want to do it. It makes a lot of sense, won't be used by a lot of people. And I don't know that we want to have a separate zoning petition every time one of those things comes up, and then another separate zoning petition every time we realize we didn't pass it perfectly. So for me, I've regrouped on this discussion. I'm trying to use it more as a thought instrument. I really look forward to seeing the planning board's report, because I thought that was a fascinating discussion, both in terms of guidance on how a zoning recommendation might be better crafted, as well as just the balancing of concerns that we need to consider when rezoning the city. So I do thank everyone for their attention to this, and while I am disappointed it won't be enacted, I don't think it was all a futile effort, and I think we all have a part to play in these future discussions. Thank you.
I was also at the planning board. It was a good discussion. In fact, it was broader than previous discussions on the matter. But I come back to the simple solution for the heat loss and the water runoff, and that is standard construction now, to add an insulated roof that is pitched to drain the water into dry wells, hopefully dry wells. So that is very much in the spirit of adding insulation to buildings that you previously discussed. The other thing that came up, which I totally concur with, is the examples of the fourth floor attics that you showed. Is structurally you put a pitched roof on it because that's where the walls will hold the weight, and not the solution shown, which is really one person's solution. And I agree with that. That I could see as, if there were unique circumstances, that would be considered probably a variance, but very much in the spirit of the housing that we have, So I do think the issue you brought up does hit at the heart, because it is an issue, but I do think there are other ways to deal with it that don't necessarily gain additional FAR. And if it is warranted to have a pitched roof, then go all the way and do it in a way that feels comfortable with the other buildings around it. So I don't think it's a lost cause, and I think members of the planning board, in particular Hugh Russell, saw that and mentioned that as something that does need to be discussed and a solution found. So it does support what your big goal is, but maybe not the manner in which the solution has been shown. Other council comments? So I'm not sure who raised their finger first. I will go with Councilor Zondervan because he's closer.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've made a lot of modifications to my home that didn't require zoning. I've installed a lot of rain barrels around the city, and that didn't require zoning changes. So I think to some extent there's a lot of these things that we can do already that don't require us to look at the zoning. On the other hand, there are situations where it does become challenging, particularly with the insulation, as was discussed, but also with houses that are not conforming now. When somebody then tries to make major improvements, they run into all kinds of issues. I do think there's room here to consider a collection of these ideas that could address the smaller buildings that make up the majority of our housing stock. It's easy to overlook them. We always go for the big buildings, and it makes sense. But at some point, we do have to deal with these existing buildings as well, and we keep deferring that. So I think there is room for a broader effort that looks at the overall question of how do we address our existing buildings, particularly the residential ones, and what changes do we need to make in the zoning that facilitate some of these sustainability upgrades.
Thank you. Vice Mayor, I believe you're next.
Thank you. I agree with Councilor Zondervan and Councilor Kelly's prognosis for the future of this particular petition. I think you're right on that a simple solution exists, and given that I think the majority of these triple deckers probably are already condoed, it just doesn't seem that likely that a condo association would be able to figure out how to do it, because the other thing it does is it gives one of the three owners with the additional FAR a greater share of the association, and that upsets the balance of who's in charge of the building, who has more votes or who pays more. So I just don't see it really being something that, unless a whole building turned over to a developer who was going to do a gut renovation and who would do the smart things that are already within reach, would do. So I don't know if when developers and contractors apply for building permits, if the building department says, if you haven't already thought of it, we encourage you to consider figuring out how to get rid of the center drain, and I don't know how much that sort of as a matter of course for any architect developer would do that, and you wouldn't need a reminder that it's a good idea, but that would be a simple solution. Yeah.
Thank you. Councilor Siddiqui.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to my colleague, Councilor Kelly. I think you asked for some feedback about how do we deal with the small things. I think, as someone who has a year or so under her belt, one thing I was struck by with this is that compared to other petitions and other issues we talk about, including accessory dwellings, it felt that this particular issue was being pushed, it has been being pushed by one particular person, two particular people. And so I'm not saying that should exclude this, but it does make me, when I analyze it and hear about it, something that I weigh differently than the accessory dwelling petition that, I've gotten several emails about it, and it has, I think, also a broader impact. So I think moving forward and thinking about future petitions, I think we have to think about that and numbers, because I think there is a power in numbers. So that's what I was saying, and I mean that respectfully. I just think that for someone just very new to petitions and how we think about those things, it did feel, and I've had conversations with a number of people about this, it just didn't, I think that's something that has weighed on me and made me think differently about this.
Thank you. So we're at the, unless Councilor Kelly, yes, please.
So thank you all for your comments. I have a question about the roof part, which is if you're at 35 feet and you want to pitch it, you're going to have to go through the 35-foot part anyways. So arguably, folks that want to do that can't do it on our current zoning. And if one of the planning board's concerns was sort of preserving neighborhoods and the iconic picture of Cambridge triple deckers, if few people are actually going to do this, it doesn't seem like it would have that much of an impact. So I think that isn't as strong an argument as one might think. And then as far as, and I agree entirely about the desire to have lots of people thinking about zoning changes. Of course, Patrick, who I'm sure we'll see later, was the face of the modification to the existing accessory dwelling unit. So it's not uncommon that a zoning change is championed by one person who has a very, very, and Patrick was clear about this, as was Nikolai, who has a very specific thought on how that change might impact them in a positive way. So yes, I agree on the impact of numbers, but I do also think that it's not uncommon for people to push successful zoning changes without a really clear groundswell of people even thinking about it, much less being supportive. And I think we'll bump into that more often as folks say, why can't I? I want to do this one thing, and no one else in the city is doing it, and the rules say you can't, but the rules, when they were written, didn't take into account that some sort of new technology would be brought up. So somehow we need to find a less clunky way to get there. And I don't know whether it's sort of like Councilor Zondervan was saying, we take stuff and we put it in a bucket and we try and parse it out to see what can all go into one discussion and what can't. And I think that for me, this is just a good way to tip off the discussion of both the mayor/manager special commission and also what Envision is going to hand us in terms of environmental issues.
Thank you. Councilor Zondervan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a clarification on the pitched roof solution that you're suggesting. In my mind, it's not a pitched roof, it's just sloped. So it could be 1 inch higher on one end than the other hand, and it's just a big ramp, basically. Is that correct?
I was referring to the example slide that Councilor Kelly showed that had in essence, a fourth floor attic, which was a style called Colonial Revival.
That's not what I'm asking about. You said there is a solution already, which is
yes, the pitch would be very moderate. You wouldn't even see it from the street. And all it is styrofoam. The minimum amount of styrofoam would be what you need for insulation. And then it goes up about 1/4 of an inch to a foot to allow water to flow. That's very standard commercial roof construction. And
right, so
that would be allowed.
Right, so even if you're at 35 feet, you would still be able to go up a few inches to create a
I would
slope?
assume that that's in the zoning for insulation. That was specifically walls were discussed, not the roof? Not the roof. So we might have to modify that and not need to seek a variance. First, we'll go to Mr. Roberts.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the height of for a structure in a district with a 35-foot height limit, if it is taller than 35 feet, then it would be a non-conforming structure. So there could be an issue if a structure like that were not simply maintaining the roof, but we're making an alteration or replacing the roof in such a way that it further increased the nonconformity. So that's something that it's not currently addressed in the insulation provision. That the insulation provisions have to do with walls and setbacks. But if this is something that it could be addressed in the zoning if it were an issue that has come up enough. I'm not sure that this is not an issue that has been brought to. I understand how it could potentially be an issue, but it hasn't been raised specifically to me as something that needed to be addressed. So.
Sure. I can guarantee it happens now. Just happens with insulation. Putting in a new roof. People probably don't even think it's an issue. But to follow up on Councilor Kelly and Mr. Roberts' comments, we could easily modify that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would think it would be a good idea to do that because if, as you say, it happens anyway, then those buildings are now non-conforming, and if they find that out later, that could cause a problem. So it might make sense for us to adjust our zoning so that they're not non-conforming for that purpose.
And the truth is, we're probably talking about 3 inches on 3 family units. On whether it's an apartment building like I live in, it's possible it could be more because of the size and direction. Vice Mayor, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to agree that it should be formalized through I believe there's some zoning that is underway because I've communicated with various members of CDD about the setbacks of adding insulation on the walls and the side setbacks. And so that zoning could also include things that would make minor changes to the roof. I mean, it sort of seems like a huge double standard when we talk about, a lab building that's limited to 120 feet, but they get to 150 for mechanicals, and we have air conditioning units on roofs that stick way up and aren't counted and are ugly. So, that seems like it should just be allowed if it has a purpose for, improving the insulation.
Very good point. So, if there are no other comments, with my apology to the co-chair, I sense that we are going to refer this to the full council with an unfavorable recommendation. Do I see consensus on that? All those in Councilor Kelly, go ahead.
Why wouldn't we I think it's dead, and I don't have any problems with that at all, but why wouldn't we just keep it in committee and let it expire?
Is there a reason?
We did that with that marijuana petition as well. So I guess what I'm saying is I wouldn't want to bring this back up again simply for the sake of bringing it back up again. I don't know why we would want to keep us from having this option or similar option in the future.
What is the consent, since the request has
Mr. Chair.
been made? I'll let you speak first, Vice Mayor. What is the consensus of the committee? Ms. Vice Mayor, you're first.
Letting it expire, it seems gentle, but it also does open the door to having it come before us a 4th time. And I think the staff's time and our time, we are becoming the Department of Small Things by having to continually answer the same question over and over again.
Fellow councilors?
Thank you,
Councilor
Mr.
Mallon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to say literally the same thing as the Vice Mayor. This has expired 2 other times in the past. I think we should forward it on with an unfavorable recommendation. To be mindful of staff time, this does take time out of the CDD's department, and particularly Mr. Roberts, who I am Shore, I actually know, has a backlog of zoning that needs to get done. So I would be in favor of forwarding this on with an unfavorable recommendation.
Mr. Chair?
First, I'll let Councilor Zondervan and others speak, since you spoke just recently. Yes?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also think that we do need to put this to bed. I do think we could come out with some separate recommendations from this discussion that I think will be beneficial to us going forward, but I wouldn't want us to have to discuss this specific idea again and again and again.
Yes. Before Councilor Kelly, do you wish? No. Councilor Kelly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I understand the sentiments. I don't think it's entirely accurate to say this is the third time it's really been considered, because the second time it never got the planning board proposal. So it came back here again because the planning board didn't make quorum, and so the whole process had to start again. So I'm happy folks think that twice is enough is fine, but it really didn't have three bites at this particular apple.
Is there a proposal on the floor? Is it consistent to what I said initially? Please.
Happy to put that proposal forward, to make a motion to forward it to the full council with an unfavorable recommendation.
So all those in favor say aye. Those against? So I believe that's 5-1. I want to thank you for all coming. You have hopefully just a 52-minute break because we can't meet until 3. And I think the next issue is very interesting, and there's a lot of merit to it, and that we'll have a good discussion on it. So thank you all. This meeting is concluded. Thank you, Craig. Whatever you want.
Are there those for the next meeting? No? No.